Hey, thank you, Paige, who is also taller than I am, so pardon me while I make some adjustments. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's really great to be here today to support a fantastic exhibition on Rachel Ruysch, curated here at the MFA by my colleague Antine Knopp. It's been a great way to connect with some of my own research interests that predate my time here in Boston. I'll start out by saying that there will be some text-heavy slides. We'll walk through them and I'll recite most of them, but if anyone at the back at any point feels like you want to move up to get a better view, please feel free. I should also say that I have a bunch of notes, but I'm going to try to keep this casual and conversational rather than a lecture. So really at any point, if anyone has questions, feel free, and I know that we'll have more dedicated time at the end. So, what early modern women knew? So for our conversation today, I'm going to be considering the concept of early modern women, and specifically in the Netherlands, as polymaths. So we might know this term polymath better and more popularly with the idea of a quote-unquote Renaissance man or Renaissance person, a term that's been applied backward to people like Leonardo da Vinci, Galileo, the great men of the Renaissance who displayed this kind of voracious interest in knowledge. So this is tied to how richly interdisciplinary the world of the early modern era was. There weren't the kind of divisions between medicine, science, art, poetry that we might think of today. And so I think it's really interesting to explore these period terms of people who were crossing lots of different disciplines, especially considering that interdisciplinarity and cross-disciplinary work and research is such a part of our contemporary world again. Richard Burton, the British writer, was the first to popularize the concept of the polymath, although it had been in use since the early 1600s. And it was intended to describe a person who was voraciously curious and wanted to learn as much quote-unquote general knowledge as possible, so as many different areas as possible. And he included the term in his 1624 book, The Anatomy of Melancholy, to talk about the scholarly endeavor, the endeavor of wanting to learn, and wanting to learn about a lot of different things, which I imagine that if you're in one of these MFA courses, you might also be a polymathic type of person, or a person that's inclined to know a lot about many different areas of art and history and life, and this was certainly a desire in the early modern period. Now, women, because they were largely shut out of most formal models of training and education, such as universities or art academies, I am inclined to think that they were even more likely than men and their male peers to cross between and move among different disciplines and activities. And in the Netherlands especially, Rachel Ruysch, as a scientist, as an artist, as a writer, is a brilliant example of how women, especially in the Netherlands, were navigating these different arenas. So she's only one example, and today I'm going to talk about some other examples of women who pushed boundaries and progressively crafted more public lives and careers in the 1600s and 1700s. Some things I'd like us to keep in mind as we're talking: how were women's limitations also opportunities for creativity across disciplines? What did early modern women know, and how did they communicate what they knew? Today we're going to look at a handful of other Dutch female artists and writers working in the late 1600s and early 1700s to examine how these micro-histories can begin to reveal women's creative lives in richer, fuller ways. And just as an example of some of the other great research that's gone into early modern women recently, these are some publications that have also been tied to exhibitions: Making Her Mark, The History of Women Artists in Europe, 1400 to 1800, which was on view in Canada and in Baltimore; women artists from Antwerp to Amsterdam, which you can go see down in Washington, D.C. right now. And of course, our Rachel Ruysch exhibition and its publication here at the MFA until early December. And so I think that the idea of microhistories and what a microhistory is especially helpful when it comes to looking at early modern women, and indeed many people that fell on the margins of history or the margins of recorded history. So historians think about microhistories essentially as opportunities to think about big ideas with very small case studies. So it's often a very small section of society, a neighborhood, a town, or an individual person, which is the approach that I'm using today. So while my case studies are about very specific women, specific moments in their lives, and how, what kind of stories they've left us with, and their documentation, there are also opportunities to think about some big ideas. So some of the big ideas I'm going to be thinking of today involve, to go back to the case studies, involve things like translations between art, poetry, and science. Also, women's romantic and erotic expressions, including same-sex desire. And so with my first case study, she really brings a lot of these big ideas together into one life, and so her life is an opportunity to think in a lot of different directions. So I'll move into my case study one, a new Sappho, Titia Brongersma, a little-known queer artist, poet, archaeologist. So 17th century polymath Titia Brongersma lived in regions of the northern Netherlands and Friesland, so far, far north in the Netherlands, and distance from the era's better-known cultural centers of someplace like The Hague or Amsterdam. She published only one book and leaves little trace in the archives. Nevertheless, she cultivated a career as an artist, poet, humanist, and a member of a diverse social circle of other artists and intellectuals. It's well established that pre-modern women artists have traditionally been at particular risk of being effaced from the historical record. And again, we can think of Ruysch as a really productive example of this, someone who was very famous in her lifetime, but which we've had to rediscover and recover in the past few years. And this is true for so many women of the era. They were well known in their lifetimes, they led public lives, they published, and yet their histories were intentionally and unintentionally suppressed over time. So to go back to Brongersma, she is an artist, she was an artist, which we know from her writings, but she's also an artist who has left no artistic output that we know. We don't have a single work of art that is attributed to her. And so what I'm showing you on screen here is a depiction of her that was featured in a different publication by a male author. And this is one of the only images of her that we have remaining. And so while Brongersma's visual artworks are, as far as we know, completely lost, we know that she was an artist because she described herself that way. She described how she was a sculptor of clay, a draftsperson, someone who made drawings, a painter, and also a scholar and antiquarian. And she's slowly being reincorporated back into histories of literature and archaeology, but this lack of her existing work, this lack of anything we can look at as art historians and viewers, has meant that art historians have been much slower to consider her in histories of art at the period. And I'm going to look at a few examples from her life and her correspondences, and I'll start with a very important correspondence she has with her friend Ludolf Smids, a male writer and antiquarian, and then also her correspondences preserved in poetry with other women in her really intimate, close art circle. And by looking at these circles that she navigated, these different friends that she had and friendships that she cultivated, we can see how she leveraged those friendships and leveraged the types of people who she knew and was in contact with in order to gain new knowledge, to promote her own work and findings, and they were crucial resources for her in her creative and intellectual practices. So what we're seeing here, a rather strange image, is of an archaeological dig, essentially, that Titia Brongersma orchestrated. And what we see here is the dig preserved in an illustration in a book that was written by her friend Ludolf Smids, who was a doctor, intellectual, and antiquarian, another real polymath. And so what he's recording is this megalithic tomb in the northern part of the Netherlands. They're still there. You can go see them. They're, I would say, as I've talked to many people and seen them myself, less impressive than Stonehenge, but similar in age. And so this is an area where Titia spent her childhood, where she, as Dutch children still do today, scambled around and climbed up and down these tombs, these megalithic tombs. And so they were things that already fascinated Dutch people in the Netherlands. They wanted to know how they were made, how those stones got there, how they got into these arrangements, and who had used them. And so in 1685, Titia finally decides she's there, staying with friends and family, and she decides to dig one of them up. So she hires some local men, and that's really what we see in this detail, that she's working with the men who she's hired. She's seated on the very far bottom left there, and we can see other men digging up the tombs. I think proportions are a little bit off. They've made it a little grander than it is in real life. It's about the size of an adult person. And Titia is depicted here not in contemporary Dutch dress, but in ancient Roman dress. And so she's, ancient Greek dress. And she's depicted here as a new Sappho. So Sappho is often thought of as a counterpart to Homer, as one of the most important Greek intellectuals, early intellectuals in the humanistic endeavor, and the name of Sappho was often given to any woman writer in this period, but had a really special relationship, as we're finding, with Brongersma. So she's seated here in her role as a classical poet, who is also the lead on this archaeological dig. And so Smids commissions a printmaker to make this image as documentation for the dig, and he included it in his book, which is essentially a book of great histories of great things within the Netherlands, within the long history of the Netherlands. And often when Titia Brongersma's name comes up now, it's because she's considered a sort of proto-archaeologist. So it comes up in accounts of the history of archaeology in the Netherlands and in Northern Europe, and this is still considered the first archaeological dig of non-Roman antiquities, so of indigenous Dutch antiquities in the area. So this predates early digs at Stonehenge even. And so everyone's curious. What are these things? What are these tombs? What's in them? And what she found when she went and had people dig underneath them is that, in fact, there were tombs, that there were human remains, there were ceramic shards, and we know from the correspondence between Brongersma and Smids, between these two friends, that they solved some problems for themselves. They generated new knowledge about these sites. Traditionally, before this, the kind of symbolic narratives of the Hunebedden, as they're called in Dutch, were that they were built by giants or Huns. So the word Hun had the meaning of Attila and the Huns in the period. It also translated into a giant or a monster. And there are even prints that record what people thought that the giants might have looked like as they were building these tombs. So the figures that look like children on the right here are meant to be quote unquote normal humans, and then the larger figures are the giants. And so you can see this is from 1660, so this is really new cutting edge information that Brangersma and Smids are trading back and forth in an antiquarian and historical context. So they make a note to one another. They note that the human remains are quote unquote normal sized and not giant. So we've solved one mystery. They were definitely built by humans. And they also write in detail about the ceramic shards and ceramic vessels that were found as well, hypothesizing about how they were involved in ritual, spiritual practices and death rites. Another theory floating around about the Hunebeda, or these megalithic tombs, was that they were built by Egyptians that had found their way to the northern Netherlands, because the pyramids were some of the only things that they could think of that kind of matched the age and the technology that it took to move these giant boulders around. And so they preserve these fragments. They even mail them back and forth to one another and then mail them on to other people in antiquarian social circles in Amsterdam and surrounding areas. So this is really this was buzzy news at the time. It was really kind of hot off the presses. And so one of the things that Smids writes when in his book about the event is, at quote, so far as I know, she is the first, so Titia Brangersma is the first to dig beneath these stones, truly a deed to be eternalized by the art of poetry. And so then he includes a poem that he has written, a dedication to his friend. He notes how they are Hertfrienden, or close friends, friends of the heart, and that now all appreciators of art will know her because of this momentous thing that she's done of digging up these tombs. And so by referencing one another in their published writings, Brangersma and Smids reinforced how humanist friendships undergirded the pursuit of knowledge during this time. So it was important to not just research things in books, but to go out into the countryside to look for things that seemed to hold secret knowledge or secret information and to find out more about it. And then to tell people about it, because it's no good if you don't tell anyone. And so this shows how women's writings, which before the 1600s largely did remain private or were rarely published, this moment when we get to the second half and the later in the 1600s, which is when Ruysch is beginning to work as well, this is a time where women's writing becomes progressively more publicly accessible, either because it's published in men's work or because women themselves begin to publish. And so this is the frontispiece for Titia Brangersma's book, the one book that she published and essentially self-published, which was pretty unusual at the time. Usually you would have a husband or a father or a brother who was a publisher who would kind of make introductions and go through the process with you. She seems to have done that entirely independently. There's a series of poems by quote-unquote great men, her male friends, to introduce the book, including one to the printer, the printmaker who designed this frontispiece. And from their exchanges, it seems that they worked in collaboration to create this image. And so at this point, I'm going to transition from what we know about Titia Brangersma's relationships with men, with fellow male humanists, with other antiquarians, other artists and poets, and transition into the way that she speaks to female readers and viewers, and especially her own group of female friends. And so what we see in the frontispiece in this book, especially if you can make out this detail on the right, so this says Groninger Bronswan, which means the swan of the well of Groningen, which is the area where she was living, where she grew up. And so because her name is Brongersma, Bron, this idea of a well or a well spring or a fresh spring, is a pun on her name. And she uses these two kind of attributes of Sappho on the one hand, the famous Greek poetess from history, and the swan on the other hand, as this kind of pun on her name and the idea of the swan at the well. And what she's had depicted, or what she's worked with this printmaker to depict, is a group of women, including her. And so, let's see, does this work? No, okay. So, there we go. So if you can follow the green dot, you see this group of women here. This is most likely Titia Brongersma here. She has her hand at her chest, as if she's orating, as she's speaking, calling people to her attention. And then you can see all of her female friends are watching her and observing her, or even, extending an arm in kind of praise of their friend. These two women are holding hands. This woman's looking kind of adoringly up at Titia. And this is really a microcosm of her life, of her life cultivating intimate friendships with other women, other female intellectuals and creatives. And we can see her interest in specifically promoting creative women, polymathic women in her poems as well. So this is to one of her friends. It's dedicated at the top, which is pretty common for poems at this period. They would be dedicated to a work of art or a person. And so she writes to her friend, "Lesbos boasts of Sappho, let it. I boast of you and Groningen's gallant female circle. For the woman who merits glory deserves her praise. No one wins the crown of Pallas for nothing, and Pallas is a connection to Athena. These poems can be a bit dense, but I'll summarize at the end. Talent demands deference. Thebes may raise Corinna to the skies. My swan," so here she's talking about herself as a swan, "carries you on her wings to the sun and sings a panegyric from her well, while she makes waves, swimming, and will do so long after she has the power, spreading your lovely name like daylight." So there are many examples like this. She praises her female friends who are writers, poets, artists, through other kinds of crafts and handiwork. And this is the bulk of her book of poetry, are these dedications to women in her own circle. And so I was curious about how she was using the symbol of Sappho and the symbol of the swan as kind of doubles for herself and her kind of poetic voice. So I found a few other examples that swans were often linked to poetry in the period, with male poets as well taking on this moniker. And this is because of the whole concept of a swan song. As a very brief aside, just because I did not know this, the term swan song comes from a medieval understanding that swans never vocalized, never made any noise their entire living lives. But then when they died, they let out one kind of throaty call that was their death cry. And that is why a swan song is called a swan song. It's not biologically true. It's nice to think about. Not true, but it was something that retained the idea of someone who kind of rarely speaks, but when they do speak, it's really important. And interestingly, the swan is often seen as a masculine figure, a throaty voice, a deep voice. And so it's interesting to observe that Titia, as a woman, is adopting this idea, this concept and symbol of the swan. And then on the flip side, comparisons with swans and Sappho appear throughout her own poems and then also in the dedications to her. So this is actually We otherwise don't know this person's work. Johannes Ferensma, he was a local painter, and he did other paintings for Titia Brangersma, which we also don't know, and he very likely had a hand in designing the print on the left here. And so what he writes in her book, even Sappho stands abashed, concedes defeat, now Titia looms, up now brilliant Sappho herself is outshone. So these poems, they can be a bit dense, they can be a bit what we might think of as overwritten, but it's very much the style of the period to be very effusive and kind of go into these emotional heights that poetry and art allow you to get to. And one of the things that we find out in reading more of Titia Brangersma's poems is how she is operating at this moment in the late 1600s, just as we're getting to the transition from Sappho as a historical figure, as an important, almost desexed or androgynous or more masculine figure in the history of Greek humanism and the origins of knowledge, into Sappho as sapphic, so specifically relating her to the experience of queer women, of lesbians, the idea of lesbos. And so there's not a lot of documentation of exactly when that transition happens, and it happens unevenly in different arenas. So Sappho is mentioned as a lesbian in medical texts, for instance, but she's not mentioned as a lesbian in accounts of poetry or classical history. And so we don't really know. This is a point where we really have to work around the edges of what remains in the archives. And I think that that's where these microhistories, so really delving in on someone like Titia Brangersma, can be really helpful to think about same-sex desire in this period where it was very firmly suppressed officially, but certainly a part of people's lives. And if we go on to this example, another poem from Titia, this is for a different female friend, and the dedication tells us that it's specifically about this friend's skill with clay and wax models. So I've chosen a sort of random example at the lower right, but this is what these things would have looked like. You could even purchase kits to help you create them, and they were very, very common crafts that women made and worked with and collaborated on in their homes, making these giant cornucopias and wax bouquets and things like that. And so in this poem, she's also referring to a classical past. And so she writes of her friend, unfasten the blindfold from Pomona's eyes so she can see the glory ebbing from her. Cornucopia and Judith depicts the horn of plenty, cherry, plum, pear, and lemon, curvy, each with its proper leaf attaching, mixed with others in festoons so charming. Fame ripens quickly, spreads with suggestion. Now let us gather flowers, weave a bouquet, into the garland Judith, who's her friend, merits and will wear. And so her poems often are very erotic and very passionate, and she sometimes uses a male voice and sometimes a female voice and sometimes a voice that's indeterminate. We can't really tell one way or another, or the voice of a swan or something beyond the human as well. And so I think what you learn about her and her circle through looking at these poems is a different way of encountering women's art from the period also, and ideas around audience reception, which are really difficult things to recover when we were working in the 1600s, 1700s. How did people actually live with and think about and respond to the works of art around them? And so I've included here a couple of examples of this story of Pomona and Vertumnus, and so this is one of many stories where Zeus was masquerading as a woman to seduce another woman. And so these sorts of scenes, these classical scenes where there's a mythological reason for two women to be seen in intimate erotic encounters with one another, these have often been discussed as hugely popular with male audiences, with presumably straight male audiences, but it's much rarer that we think about what these kinds of paintings that were circulating the Republic, the area of the Netherlands, could mean for women and women who experienced same-sex desire. Desire was much more fluid then than it is now. We really don't get a form of having an identity as a queer person, or someone a man who preferred men or a woman who preferred women, until into the first quarter of the 1700s. So we're working in a period where there's still a lot of passing, so to speak. And so I think that what I've learned from reading more women's poetry is that they were very likely, as viewers of artworks, as people interested in art and culture, bringing a different kind of frame of reference to works that we would normally think of as catering to a straight male gaze. And so, let me just pick up where I was. And so in this context, Bronger's most frequent voice of a female or a gender ambiguous protector of women, both real and mythological, becomes even more striking. In this role, she positioned herself in her poems as the opposite of a Zeus or a Jupiter, as the opposite of a satyr or other masculine mythological figures who she viewed as preying on women. She makes frequent mention of Callisto, Andromeda, and other women in distress throughout her book. And one of my favorites, a poem that's titled, "On a picture of a satyr chasing a nymph who, in panic, reverts her gaze at the pursuer, eager to escape his clutches." It's a long but very evocative title for a short poem. And in this case, she's specifically writing about one of the works of art that she has in her household, so part of her personal collection. This is an example by Rubens and Bruegel that would have been very popular and circulated and had many variations that would have been available for viewing during the period. And so you can see this very muscular satyr is preying upon this very pale, youthful, lithe nymph as they have an exchange which I think for a straight male viewer could be read as very titillating, but Tizia obviously saw something very different in paintings like this one. So she writes, "Stop, satyr, stop. You want to paw her? Her fear is evident by her flight." And the poem continues, I have some of it here, and she concludes really emphatically, "Listen, I'll tear you to bits unless my arms and not your claws receive her youth." And so here she's positioning herself as not just a champion of her female friends, but a rescuer of women within paintings who are experiencing distress, which I think is a really interesting alternative kind of reception history of these works of art. And I think that this will lead into the next case study that I'm now going to transition us over to, which again considers how even if we don't have the same volume of works of art by women, Rachel Ruysch is still fairly rare in the number of works that we have by her available, that for women where we don't have that kind of body of work, we can look at other ways that they were interacting with arts and culture, not only as makers, but also as viewers and interpreters and people who were viewing one thing and using it as inspiration in another form, like painting into poetry. For Brongersma, her subtly transgressive, visually evocative, passionate, gender-bending, sensual voice highlight the central importance of both literary and artistic culture in her fashioning of a persona as a Sappho reborn. And moreover, she shows us how spectators, and we often think of the idea of queer studies as being something new, but I think her poems show how people have been queering early modern art since its original creation, and should remind us of the value of looking beyond a black and white understanding of who these works were appealing to and how. So I'm going to move into our second case study with some more names that you may not have heard of. So the second case study takes as its root this kind of rise of the night as a romantic space. And it looks at receptions of that rise, of that theme of romantic night in poetry and in visual works by two poets, Cornelia van te Veer and Caterina Lascalia, and one artist, Gesine ter Borch. And so with this case study, I'm going to begin with a poem by van der Veer. And I think that this poem, again, speaks to the way that these women were considering art, poetry, science, technology as these very fluid boundaries, and they were calling upon all of their knowledge in order to produce the creative work that they were interested in. So this is text, but there's still a lot of visual evocation in it. So in this poem, begins, when last I had the joy to catch a glimpse of you, you from Kajolkel's step were about to descend, on New Year's Eve, at the old year's end, when to us was shown the first small hour, all new, yet I saw you there, you did not notice me. And what she's talking about here is being out on New Year's Eve, after midnight. The metaphorical ball has dropped and people are navigating Amsterdam. They're going to after parties. They're circulating around the canals. And she catches a glimpse of her friend, Caterina Lascalia, who doesn't notice her. So she decides, kind of voyeuristically, which she describes in her poem, to follow her friend. And so I won't recite the entire thing, but basically, she's following her in the darkness, in the shadow of night, watching her friend go from another mutual friend's house to a different friend's house, and she knows that they haven't been in touch themselves for some time. So she's wondering, could it really be her friend who's essentially going to these other parties and leaving her out of it? And she narrates for herself her feelings as she's following the canals, ducking around corners, kind of looking at her friend from out of the shadows. And she ends by, again, drawing upon these tropes of classical histories, but that often enabled some gender bending that wouldn't have been otherwise possible. I turn and find myself upon the central span, so the square, part of the city, where you by me were keenly watched like Galatea by Polyphemus's eye up to your sister's door, which you entered, and me even more, certain it was you, as impressions in soft clay are. In vain of the unhappy chance did I complain, and sent my sighs, like Dido, after you. Alas, you'd faded, ghost-like, and left me to rue. And so in this case, we're again seeing two women who shared a very intimate, close relationship, and we see Cornelia van te Veer's longing for this friend that she feels she's had a falling out with. Whether or not their relationship was consummated physically, this is another example of just how prevalent women's same-sex desire was in the period when you go looking for it. And so with this poem, again, I wondered, what was inspiring her? What might she have been looking at during the period and thinking of as she's drafting this series of poems back and forth to her friend? And so I'm going to show these briefly as another woman's response to a similar theme, and then I'm going to get us back to this idea of the theme of night as a romantic space. This is Gesine ter Borch, and this is part of a very small series of nocturnal watercolors that she completed. I also mention her here because there's a great new book about her out by Adam Aker of the Metropolitan Museum, and there's an exhibition coming up in the next year or so that will focus on her. So thinking about these images and reading Van de Veer's poem, I got to thinking there are these women's responses to this idea of night as a romantic space, as an erotic space, as a space they themselves could navigate. And that's pretty new in the period. And so what I'm linking this to is a rise in paintings, but also in prints and books that specifically address the idea of night and a new sense of nightlife and night culture as a time of exception in general, and so within that exceptionality, a time that could be taken advantage of for love trysts, for flirtations, for courtships. And so this has a few different origin stories, but I show this example to show how this interest in depicting people interacting at night and carrying on romantic liaisons was coming out of an interest in night in general and the rise of nocturnal imagery. And I'll just point out in this image, a print by Jan van de Velde II. If you look up at this diagonal right here, you might see the Milky Way or some evocation of it. And so this is directly lifted from other prints that were circulating in Rome a little bit before this, right around 1609, 1610, and this is when Galileo makes his observations of the surface of the moon and describes the Milky Way in more detail. And so you start to see this new interest in moon gazing, stargazing, and going out and about at night, not to go from one place to another, but actually to observe the night and be in it. However, this was a very complicated idea for women, even in the Netherlands, where they were relatively more free and advantaged than women in other parts of Europe. Because traditionally, night was a time really when no good things happened. And I have a couple of older examples from the Renaissance that get us thinking about this. The work on the right, apologies for the lack of title, but this is a work by Hans Sebald Behem from around the same time. And so in the Albrecht Dürer, you can see how night is envisioned as a man, a doctor, dreaming, who's having devilish whisperings blown into his ear by a pair of bellows as this beautiful naked woman really symbolizes the erotic temptations of night and what he might be dreaming about. On the right, the Behem literally allegorizes night as a naked woman at night in a bed with her genitals displayed for the viewer. And so the feminine and the nocturnal were linked together in this idea of temptation, that going out at night was basically asking to experience fall. It was asking to be intoxicated, to be seduced. And for a woman, if you were out at night, you were either assumed to be a sex worker, assumed to be a prostitute, or assumed to be a woman who could be bought for a price, even if you were not actively working as a prostitute. Now, what starts happening as we get further into the 1600s, this interest in stargazing, people staying up later, observing the night, is that women were certainly a part of that. And when we get to some of the print imagery and that was circulating in prints and books, we start to see that. We start to see these new nocturnal courtship practices and scenes of lovers. And so what we see here, these are from the early 1620s, we see how there's a visual language that turns on these scenes of street corners and corridors and of men and women interacting with one another. So on the left, you can see that this courting couple or this couple at the threshold of a house is being accompanied by a full carriage, a full group of naked mythological cavorting lovers and little putti holding up torches so that the little sort of baby-looking guys are holding up these torches to literally allow light to shine upon their romance. You also see women kind of rejecting these circumstances at the same time. And so on the work on the right, you see a woman who's placing her hand up and sort of turning away from the suitor who's coming upon her. And so as artists get interested in night scenes, and especially in these scenes of nocturnal eroticism and nocturnal romance, I think one of the interesting things for me that happens is that the aesthetic and the social really come together. These were scenes that allowed artists to experiment with things like bizarre lighting effects. You can see these oversized lanterns that become really common in these images. And so they were a technical feat for artists, for both painters and printers. And then they also documented and recorded these new social circumstances of people being out at night and the pleasures and dangers that came along with that. And so, for instance, in the scene on the right here, you see a whole family drama unfolding. So we've got this young woman who's either just entering or just leaving this house where there's a smiling man, probably her lover, and then her parents have found them. They've hired this young link boy, they were called, or a torch boy, to light their way. And even the family dog seems horrified at this woman's actions late at night. And then technically, the shooting of the light, the scattering of shadow, also gives a very uncanny and really interesting feeling, kind of atmosphere to the entire drama. And so women and men, but women are reading these books, they're looking at these images, and to go back to the Gesine ter Borchs, this is one visual example of how another woman was looking at this type of imagery and then producing, in this case, her own visual variations of it. So I'll also note that these works are all about yay big. If you can't see me holding up my hands, they're the matter of a few inches tall and across. So very small, very much the size of something that would go into a book or be passed around. And so in translating the kind of black and white graphic quality of the prints into the much more soft and modulated tones of watercolor, I think we can see some really interesting examples of how Gesine, as a woman, is both pushing the technique, the aesthetics, the kind of technical difficulty of portraying the night, and also her own take on night as romance. So in these scenes, there are no angry parents. Even the chaperones seem to be kind of in on it. They're keeping their distance. They're not looking at the couples. And so in this, I think she gives women an agency that you don't really see in the print and painted versions by largely male printers and painters. Instead, you see something that's much more, quote unquote, poetic, that's much more atmospheric, and that kind of gives over to the idea of a romance of equals, perhaps. And even when things go wrong in her scenes of nocturnal romance, the women often also have this increased agency. So this is another watercolor by Gesine ter Borch, and in this case, she's written it to accompany a song, so she's even mimicking the format of these books of poems and songs that were circulating during the period. And so what we see here is a woman at the threshold of her house, interacting with a male suitor, and the song tells us that the woman is from northern Holland, so someone from, for instance, Amsterdam in the north, and her suitor is southern or Flemish, so from the south, and so this is going across political boundaries and religious boundaries that that people were very aware of during the period. The idea of a southerner coming up to court a northerner had its own political baggage as well, and that's something that she's working with, that kind of satirical approach to romance across boundaries. But in this in the poem that accompanies this, what we find is that this woman, the character that she's created, has no compunction in rejecting this suitor and kind of sending him away. She says, basically, go back where you came from and don't bother me anymore. And so this is very different than what you get in kind of quote-unquote canonical imagery in texts from the period, which are all about how women should stay home at night, study the Bible, and not make their way out and about at night. And Gesina is giving us a really different understanding of that. And so I'm wrapping up here, but I think that one of the things that I've hoped to show over the course of these kind of relationships between text and image is how intertwined this all was, how poets were making paintings and watercolors, watercolorists were working in clay, archaeologists were commemorating their work in poetry, and I think that this kind of really rich microcosm of the Netherlands kind of speaks to the polymathic, the interest in polymathic pursuits, in that quest for general knowledge, and the way that women were very much a part of that in both their professional and their personal lives. I should mention, while I have these pictures up, that in addition to the Cornelia van de Veer poem that I read a minute ago, her friend, the one she was writing about, Caterina Lascelia, also featured night frequently in her poems. And she writes in one case, on a different note or otherwise to love, about how her beloved conjured the person in her mind's eye as a sweet intruder in her sleep. And she has a line in which she adopts the male persona of Mars and addresses her lover as Venus, and links evocations of the burning passion of their love with the blazing stars in the night sky. In another poem, Restlessness of Love, Lascelia again uses the first person and writes about how she's so exhausted that by grief over her love affair, she finally falls asleep only to be interrupted in her dreams. She wakes from the dream to realize that the dream is a metaphor for the 1,000 deaths she must endure from the never-healing wound of love. So this interest in romantic longing, and how women of the period did not see this as something to hide necessarily. It was a part of their lives, and a part of their creative inspiration as well. And so I think that in this day and age, when there is so much work now to reincorporate our different disciplines, to think in interdisciplinary ways, that it's really valuable to go back to people in this period who were doing that. And as we found in research over the past several years, women are a key part of that group of polymaths. And that's what I have. Thank you so much. And I think we have mics for questions.
Have a question, please raise your hand. I'll bring a mic over.
Hi, a wonderful discussion, if you don't want to call it a lecture. It's wonderful. Really appreciate it. The album that you showed of Gesina, I think you showed page, it's called Folio 94 or 84, and does that mean, does folio mean page? And if so, are there many more illustrations in this folio, and have you seen it personally?
Yes, and yes. To say a little bit more about that, yes. So Gesina ter Borch is rightly, like Rachel Ruysch, finally getting her due as an artist, as a creative person, as an intellectual from this period. When she died, she left a set of folios to the women, to the female descendants in her family. And those included her own work, and they also included assembled albums from her professional artist brother, Gerard Terborch, as well as the father, and really drawings and works of art from the entire family on paper. They were a richly artistic family. Again, we could think of the example of the Ruysch household. This was a family that was humanistically inclined, that was inclined to knowledge and reading and writing and drawing. And so the father, Gerard Sr., formally trained his sons in oil painting, in draftsmanship. He does not seem to have taken the same care with Gesina's work, but she did keep her albums of her own work as well. And so when they originally came up at auction and were purchased by the Rijksmuseum, where they are now, they were mostly heralded as a way to learn more about her brother. And really and really abandoned for work on Gesina herself until Alison Kettering's really important work in the late 1980s. And that's when we start seeing more documentation. The Rijksmuseum has all of the pages scanned digitally, so you can go home and look at them in really great detail. And this specifically is referred to as the poetry album. It was probably sung. It was probably a song book. And the entire album has this kind of format of poem or song and then image. And so most of them, what I think is interesting about her nocturnal works is most of them just use the background of the page. So you'd have figures in watercolor directly on the white of the paper. But for her nocturnal works, she develops this much more rendered way of working. So they're all really beautiful. Some of them are very strange. Some of them are very funny, because she's working outside of a professional art system. She took a lot of risks. She was pretty quirky. And so her works are a real treasure trove for a very kind of individualized understanding of women's lives in this period.
Thank you. I don't exactly know how to express this question, but I was really struck by the image of the satire. It's a satire, right? Attacking the woman, and she was sort of saying like, "I don't desire this," right? Like, and so your whole presentation is focusing on women asserting their own type of desire or what desire looks like to them. But that image really, and this might just be my modern sensibility imposing this on it, but that image really struck me as almost as suggesting that by asserting my type of desire, I am rejecting your interpretation of what I might desire, right? I'm sort of saying, and that's could shade over into assault, right? And so I feel like there's a dark side to this. And then when you started talking about the night, I also, feel very much like one dark side of the night is the potential for not just fallen women, but for unwanted attention and unwanted desire. And so I'm just wondering if in this you see a potential dark side of not just unwanted desire, but like this aspect of assault or this aspect of like men taking things from us that we don't want to give them. That is sort of the flip side of the more positive approach of this is what I want and this is what desire looks to me. I don't know. Like I said, that might be a modern interpretation on it, but that's what struck me as I was looking at that.
I mean, the more that I read women's words from this period, the more that I'm convinced that this was very much on their mind and that it's not actually such an ahistorical or modern take. Absolutely, at any time of day, depending on your agency, depending on your class, how much money you had, what kind of job you were working, if you were a woman who had to work a job, if you were working in a tavern versus on the street, you were, even in areas like the Netherlands where women had relatively more agency and legal recourse for things like assault, it was still always dangerous to be out in the public as a woman at this time, absolutely. Some women could be more insulated by their wealth, but that didn't always stop things either. So a body of research that I didn't bring in here today because it's a little afar from the art historical, but that I think is important is to look at things like court transcripts, what people were getting arrested for, what people were being prosecuted for, and then how things like sexual assault were discussed within a legal framework. And so what we find is that it can get very messy very quickly, because there was sexual assault was certainly common, and you also see that reflected in erotic works mostly written for men, because a lot of them begin with a young, quote unquote, young virgin who, through no fault of her own, has one night with a man who claims he's going to marry her, and instead he takes her to a bordello or a whorehouse, and that begins her quote unquote erotic adventure as it's narrativized in these erotic texts. And in actuality, that was very common. It was more common for immigrant women to be sex workers, for impoverished women to be sex workers. And as I did mention, even if you weren't, you were, if you put yourself out in public, especially apart from male protectors or other chaperones, you were automatically considered a suspect. What I think becomes really interesting to think about within that framework, which is dark, is the way that women themselves were rejecting those kinds of rejecting those as a status quo, I guess, as a way to say it. That I think when you see with the poems here and some of the artworks that I've pictured, you see women, a female lens, a female view on what was happening in society. And I think that what you see in kind of Tizia's rejection here of this kind of imagery of the satyr as sexually desiring and absconding with and harassing and assaulting the figure of the nymph, and what you see, I think also in Gesina's changes to her visual references to get more equality. The couples are, unlike, for instance, these scenes where there's still some tension, these scenes where the woman is on the left is actively running away, on the right she's probably has her own agency, but her parents have found her out. I think that in this more kind of ambiguous and romanticized take, there's a way that she might be communicating that there are different ways of understanding what's possible for women at night in art, even perhaps if not always in life too. But I think it's a really good question. And something that I'm continuing to think about balancing, like where is it useful to talk about women's agency, and where is it useful to talk about what agency they did not have at the same time? Thank you. Could always end early if we've run out of questions. All right, well, in that case, I would suggest that if by any chance you have not been in the Ruysch exhibition, maybe you have a little bit of extra time to duck back in there and maybe think about women's networks and women's creativity in different ways. She is a great example of a polymathic figure as well. And I think there's much more to learn about women's experience at large in this period. So thank you so much for everyone's great questions and for your attention. And if you'd like to follow up at all or ask questions not in a big group, I'll hang around for a few minutes as well. And thank you so much to Kristen and Paige and the whole team for making this happen. And stay tuned for the next two in this iterations in this same course. So thank you so much.